Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Once upon a time, on a cold winter's day, when the snowflakes drifted softly to the ground, a queen sat by her window, sewing a snow-white quilt. When she looked out of the window, the wintry landscape looked like a beautiful painting framed by the black ebony window frame. As she was sewing, the queen accidentally pricked her finger with the needle, and a few drops of blood fell onto her quilt. The red drops of blood against the snowy white cloth, framed by the black ebony window frame, looked so beautiful that the queen thought to herself, "Oh, I wish I could have a child, as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony." Soon after that, the queen had a baby girl, whose skin was indeed white as snow, her lips red as blood, and her hair black as ebony. The queen called her daughter Snow White. Unfortunately, soon after the child was born, the queen died. 1 year later, the king remarried. The new queen was very beautiful, but much too vain and proud of her own beauty. She couldn't stand the thought of anyone being more beautiful than her. The queen had a magic mirror on the wall of her room. She often stood in front of the mirror, gazing at her own reflection, and she would ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror would always reply in the same way, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." The queen was always very satisfied with this answer, because she knew that the mirror always spoke the truth. Time passed, and Snow White was growing from a baby into a lovely little girl. When she was 7 years old, she had red lips, ebony black hair, and snow-white skin. She was even more beautiful than the queen. So one day, when the queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror then replied, "You, my queen, are indeed a lady fair, yet fairer still is Snow White with the ebony hair." When the queen heard these words, she became very angry. She took a good look at Snow White and could not help but see her growing beauty. Every day when she looked at the girl, her anger and jealousy grew even stronger. Over time, the queen's jealousy became so strong that she could no longer bear it. Hatred filled her heart. So one day, the queen called one of her huntsmen to her room and said to him, "I can no longer stand the sight of this child. Take her deep into the forest and kill her." The huntsman had to obey his queen. He took Snow White by the hand and led her deep into the dark forest. When they stopped, the huntsman pulled out his knife. The girl cried and begged for mercy. "Please don't kill me," she begged. "If you have mercy on me, I'll run deep into the forest, and I promise I'll never return home." When the huntsman saw the tears on the young child's face, he felt great pity for her. "Run then, my child," he said to her as he put his knife back into its sheath. "The wild animals will most likely eat the poor child anyway," he thought to himself. Snow White was terrified as she ran deeper and deeper into the woods. She didn't know where to go or what would happen to her. She was very afraid that wild animals might attack her. Snow White ran and ran over sharp stones and through prickly bushes. She heard wild animals in the bushes but none of them attacked her. By the evening, her feet were very sore, her clothes were torn, and her arms and legs were covered in cuts and bruises. When Snow White was so tired that she could barely go on, she arrived at a small cottage close to the mountains. She knocked on the door, but nobody answered. She tried the door latch, and it opened, and so she stepped in. Everything inside the cottage was very small, neat and tidy. A table, laid with a white cloth, was set with 7 small plates, filled with vegetables and bread. There were 7 small knives, 7 small forks and spoons, and 7 small cups, all in proper order. Close to the wall, there were 7 small beds, each of them neatly made with clean white covers. Snow White was hungry, thirsty, and tired, but she didn't want to take anybody else's dinner. So she ate a little bit from each of the plates and drank a little sip from each of the cups. Now, Snow White was so very tired, she could hardly stay awake. She lay down on the first small bed, but somehow it didn't feel comfortable. She tried the other small beds too, but somehow every single one of them seemed too long or too short, too hard or too soft. None of them felt very comfortable until she came to the last bed, which seemed to be made for her. She lay down, and soon she was fast asleep. The cottage was owned by 7 dwarfs. They spent all their days in the mountains digging for gold. When darkness fell, they returned to their home. When they came in, everyone lit 1 small candle. By the light of the 7 candles, the dwarves noticed that somebody had been to their cottage after they had left it that morning. The first dwarf exclaimed, "Who has sat on my chair?" The next one said, "Who has eaten from my plate?" The third wondered, "Who's taken a bite from my bread?" The fourth said, "Who has tasted my vegetables?" The fifth then said, "Who has cut with my knife?" The sixth demanded, "Who has used my fork?" The seventh said, "Who has drunk from my cup?" Then the dwarves noticed that their beds weren't as neat as they were when they had left in the morning. The first dwarf looked at his bed and exclaimed, "Who has slept in my bed?" Then the other dwarves turned to look at their beds and cried out one after the other, "And who has slept in my bed?" But when the 7th dwarf came to his bed, he found Snow White in it, in a deep slumber. "Look who's in my bed," he said to the others, and everybody ran to look. They lifted their candles while standing around the bed and stared at Snow White. "What a beautiful young girl," they all said. Because the dwarves didn't want to wake up the young child, who slept so peacefully, they tiptoed away and ate their dinner without saying a word. When it was time for bed, the 7th dwarf did not have his own bed, so he spent 1 hour at a time in every one of the other dwarfs' beds until it was morning. In the morning, when Snow White opened her eyes and saw the 7 dwarves, she was very afraid. The dwarf spoke in a kind and friendly manner and asked her name. "I am Snow White," she answered. "How in the world did you find our cottage?" the dwarves inquired. Snow White told them about her stepmother, the queen, and the huntsman who was supposed to kill her, and how the huntsman had let her go. "Then I just ran and ran," Snow White continued, until I found this cottage." When the dwarfs heard this sad story, they felt such pity for the girl. The eldest one of them said,
"If you promise to take care of us, keep our house clean and tidy, make us food, wash our laundry and fix our clothes, then you can stay and live with us. We'll take good care of you."
"Oh, you're so kind," Snow White sighed. "I would like that very much indeed." Before the dwarfs left the house, they warned Snow White.
"We're away all day," they said, "and you are all alone in the house. If your stepmother hears that you're here, she may come and try to harm you. Remember not to let anybody in while we are away."
Snow White promised to heed their warning. Snow White was very satisfied with her life. The dwarfs left for the mountains every morning to find gold, and every night when they returned, Snow White had made their suppers ready for them. The house was always clean and tidy, and even though Snow White was by herself each day, she never felt lonely because she had so much to do. The stepmother queen was very satisfied with herself. Snow White was dead, which meant that she was the most beautiful woman in the whole land. At least, that is what she thought. So a long time passed before the queen once more thought to ask her magic mirror the familiar question. She stood in front of the mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" She could hardly believe her ears when she heard the answer.
"You, my queen, are indeed a lady fair, yet fairer still is Snow White with the ebony hair. With 7 dwarfs she stays, on the other side of the mountain range."
The queen was furious. She knew that her mirror never lied. So the huntsman had betrayed her. As long as the queen knew that someone else was more beautiful than her, she could get no peace from her jealousy. The queen decided to find Snow White and kill her herself. But how could she do it? She knew that Snow White should not be able to recognize her. So the queen disguised herself to look like an old crone selling trinkets from house to house. She disguised herself so cleverly that nobody would ever have been able to know her as a beautiful queen. The queen walked through the forest until she finally arrived at the dwarf's cottage near the mountains. She knocked on the door and cried, "Laces and ribbons! Buy my beautiful laces and ribbons!" Snow White looked out of the window and thought to herself, "What harm could that poor old crone ever do?" Snow White opened the door and let the crone with her basket into the cottage. Snow White chose a beautiful pink ribbon for her corset. The old crone offered to help Snow White lace up her corset, and Snow White, who suspected nothing, agreed. Then the queen laced the corset so tight that the girl couldn't breathe. Snow White fell to the ground as though she was dead. In the evening, when the dwarves came back home, they were horrified to find their beloved Snow White on the ground, not moving. They carefully lifted her up and cut the laces loose when they noticed how tight they were. Snow White soon began to breathe again, and the color returned slowly to her cheeks. When the dwarves heard about the old crone, they were sure that it was Snow White's evil stepmother. Once more, the dwarfs warned Snow White, "Now be careful, don't let anybody into the house again." The Queen hurried back to her castle, feeling very happy because she believed that Snow White was now dead and she would be the most beautiful in the whole land. As soon as she got home, the Queen took off her disguise and stepped in front of the magic mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" the Queen inquired eagerly. But oh, the rage that came upon her when she heard the mirror's reply. "You, my Queen, are indeed a lady fair, yet fairer still is Snow White with the ebony hair. With 7 dwarfs she stays, on the other side of the mountain range." Once again, the Queen began to plot how to do away with Snow White. She decided to make a poisonous comb. She disguised herself to look like a different old woman and filled her basket with new trinkets to sell. Again, the stepmother Queen walked through the forest to the dwarf's cottage. She rapped on the door and shouted, "Beautiful cheap wares for sale." Snow White peered out through the window. "I can't let you in," she said. "I've promised the dwarfs I won't open the door for anyone." "Never mind, you can still look at my beautiful wares." The disguised Queen held a lovely comb temptingly for Snow White to see. Snow White couldn't resist it, and so she opened the door for the old woman. The old crone said, "Let me comb your lovely hair for you." Snow White agreed and sat on a chair. The Queen struck the comb sharply at Snow White's head so that the poison in the comb would affect her. The girl immediately fell to the ground as though she was dead. Luckily, it was almost evening and soon the dwarfs returned. When they found Snow White on the floor, they knew that the evil stepmother had been there again. The dwarfs found the poisonous comb in Snow White's hair and pulled it out. Snow White woke up quite quickly and told them what had happened. Once more, the dwarfs spoke to Snow White very seriously. They made her promise that she would not let anybody in when they were not around. In the meantime, the Queen hurried through the forest, muttering to herself, "Finally, I succeeded. Snow White is truly dead." When she returned to her castle, she removed her second disguise and stepped in front of her magic mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" It was the same familiar question, to which the mirror replied, "You, my Queen, are indeed a lady fair, yet fairer still is Snow White with the ebony hair. With 7 dwarfs she stays, on the other side of the mountain range." When she heard these words, the Queen jumped up and down in a fit of rage. "Snow White has to die, even at the cost of my own life," she fumed. The Queen thought that it might be impossible to make Snow White let her into the cottage for a third time. So she thought of a new plan. She took a delicious apple that had one green side to it and one rosy red side. It looked so tempting that no one could resist it. Then she poisoned the red side of the apple without touching the green side. This time, the Queen filled her basket with apples and dressed up like a friendly countrywoman. Then, for the third time, she made her way to the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. "I cannot open the door for anyone," Snow White called through the window. "That's all right, my dear," answered the countrywoman. "I just want to get rid of these apples. Here you are. You can have this one. Just taste it," she said, offering Snow White the apple. "I'm afraid to take it," answered Snow White, shaking her head. The countrywoman chuckled. "You needn't be afraid that it's poisonous," she said jokingly. "Look, I'll cut the apple in half, and we can both eat half." And in saying that, the Queen cut the apple in half, gave the red half to Snow White, and ate the green half herself. Snow White wanted to eat the apple half that looked so tempting. When she saw that the countrywoman ate her own half, she thought that no harm could come by eating an apple, and took a bite. No sooner had she taken a bite than she fell to the ground dead. The Queen laughed a terrible laugh, cackling, "This time no one can save you." So the Queen returned to her castle and asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" Finally, the mirror answered, "You, my Queen, are the fairest of them all." The jealous Queen was finally satisfied. When the dwarves returned home in the evening, they found Snow White lying lifeless on the floor. They hoped that they could revive her. They opened her corset, combed her hair, and washed her face, but nothing helped. The dwarves' hearts were broken. They stood around Snow White weeping. "Our beautiful Snow White is dead." For 3 days and nights, they stayed awake by her and mourned. After 3 days, the dwarfs decided that they should bury their beloved Snow White. Although they did not want to do it, as she still looked so beautiful, as though she were alive. So that they could still gaze upon her, they had a glass coffin made. In gold letters on the glass case, they wrote, "Here rests Snow White, daughter of the king." The dwarves carried the glass coffin to the top of the mountain, and in turns kept watch over it every day and every night. Snow White lay in the coffin without moving, just as though she was sleeping. Her skin was white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair black as ebony. Forest animals, too, came to the coffin to mourn Snow White's death. Though Snow White lay in the glass coffin for many years, she always looked as though she were alive and only sleeping. One day it came to pass that a king's son found the glass coffin on top of the mountain. He couldn't take his eyes off the beauty that lay inside it, and fell in love at first sight. "Please, give the coffin to me," the king's son begged. "I'll pay whatever you want for it." But the dwarves replied, "We won't give Snow White up for any price." The prince continued his begging. "I cannot live without her. If you give her to me, I promise I shall take care of her for the rest of my life." Finally, the dwarves took pity on the prince and agreed to give the coffin to him. As the prince's servants were carrying the coffin down from the mountain, they tripped over some tree roots. The coffin got shaken so hard that the piece of apple that was stuck in Snow White's throat flew out. Snow White opened her eyes, lifted the coffin lid, and sat up. "Where am I?" she cried in astonishment. When the prince saw this happen, his heart filled with joy. He told Snow White what had happened and how he had fallen in love with her at first sight. "Come with me to my father's castle and marry me," he said. Snow White agreed. Snow White said goodbye to the dwarves, who had been so kind and taken care of her so well. Even though the dwarves were sad to lose Snow White, They were overjoyed to know that she was alive and would be happy with the prince. A huge wedding celebration was arranged for Snow White and the prince. Everyone in the land was invited. As it happened, even Snow White's stepmother Queen was to be among the guests. After dressing in her best gown, the Queen walked over to the magic mirror, and as usual, she asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" To this, the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are a lady fair, but the young bride is beyond compare." Hearing these words made the queen so angry that she couldn't bear the thought of going to the wedding. However, the queen wanted very much to see this beautiful young bride. When she arrived at the wedding celebration, the queen recognized Snow White. Her rage was so uncontrollable that she fell to the ground. She was taken back to her own castle, where she then died. Snow White and the prince had a beautiful wedding, and they lived happily ever after.
Hybrid media book for kids.
When the snowflakes drifted softly to the ground, a queen sat by her window, sewing a snow-white quilt. When she looked out of the window, the wintry landscape looked like a beautiful painting framed by the black ebony window frame. As she was sewing,
The new, fabulous way to play and learn.
Welcome to the world of Poptory fairy tales. You can read along or just listen and enjoy the pictures.
"Who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror would always reply in the same way. "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all."
Hybrid media book for kids. Turn the page when you hear this sound. The new, fabulous way to play and learn. Hybrid media book.
Also currently in this series, The Ugly Duckling, Little Red Riding Hood, The Three Little Pigs, Sleeping Beauty, and
Santa Claus. Hybrid media book for kids. The new, fabulous way to play and learn.